am here because I am witness to the horrific events that befell European Jewry during the Second World War. And I experienced some of them. Life in a ghetto, life as a hidden child, as a slave laborer, and in 2 concentration camps. I'm one of those fast disappearing numbers of Holocaust survivors who can say, I saw it, I was there. My task this morning is to condense 5.5 years and the aftermath into 18 minutes. So I've had a very difficult job to select. I was born in Poland, in a town called Piotrkow, actually Piotrkow Trybunalski, which had a population of about 55,000, of whom some 15,000 were Jewish. There were several synagogues. This is the Great Synagogue, a splendid building which dates back to 1793. It was badly damaged during the war. I was the middle child of 3 with an older brother, Ben, and a younger sister, Lucia. My father had a flour mill. He was a partner in a flour mill. My mother was a housewife who looked after us at home. I had relatives in several nearby towns, and we used to visit and spend holidays together. I started my education at nursery, the equivalent of infants, when I was 4. And made many friends. I moved up to junior school at the age of 6. We observed the Jewish festivals, and in short, I was living a normal, happy life in a loving family at the age of 8. But in 1939, when on the 1st of September, when the German army invaded Poland, my world collapsed. My hometown, being near the border, was attacked immediately by Stuka dive bombers, which had small sirens attached to the wings to make a frightening noise. The bombs had whistles attached to them at the fins, all designed to create panic, which they did. The Polish army was no match for the Germans, so Piotrkow was very quickly overrun. The occupying troops started a campaign of looting and terror. People were attacked for no reason at all. Someone we knew, my father's accountant, was shot, and his body was left lying in the entrance to our block of flats for a whole week. The German authorities quickly imposed restrictions. All radios were confiscated, so we were isolated from the outside world, and valuables had to be handed in. Jews were placed under a curfew and were not allowed to walk in certain streets, as the sign shows here. We were also required to wear an armband with the Star of David, so that's shown here. Piotrkow was the first town in Poland to have a ghetto. At the beginning of November, all the Jews were removed from their homes and herded into a small area of the town, into which some 10,000 Jews from surrounding areas were also packed. So it immediately became very overcrowded. There could be as many as 3 families to a room. Malnutrition and the inadequate sanitary conditions caused much illness and many epidemic diseases, which in turn caused thousands of deaths. This street sign, with skull and crossbones, which I remember very well, points to the ghetto. Although there were frequent roundups and people were being sent away to various camps, the main deportation came in the autumn of 1942. And I only managed to avoid it because my father and my uncle paid for my cousin Ija and me to stay with a Polish family the Maciejewskis in a nearby town, Częstochowa, and where we lived as Christians. Now this is a slide of my cousin Ija. And this shows you where Częstochowa was in relation to my hometown. We felt very vulnerable and scared because there was actually a reward for turning in hidden Jews. And Ija, an only child, was very homesick and begged to be taken back. So after some time, the Maciejewskis supposedly took her back to Polish friends, who she said were hiding her parents' valuables. In the meantime, 22,000 people had been deported to the extermination camp of Treblinka, where they were murdered immediately. And what came to be called as the Big Ghetto was liquidated. The remaining inhabitants, mainly those with work permits, were confined to a much smaller area. And when it felt safe, my father arranged for me to return to what we called the small ghetto. When I arrived, I found that although the valuables had been collected, Ija had not been returned. There was nothing my distraught uncle and aunt could do about it, and we never found out what happened to Ija. Then, after only a few weeks, in early December, more than 500 women and children, including my mother and younger sister, were rounded up and imprisoned in the desecrated synagogue for a week, about a week, without food, water, warmth, or hygienic facilities. And at dawn on Sunday, the 20th of December, 1942, they were marched in groups of 50 to the nearby Raków forest and brutally murdered in front of newly dug mass graves. Only my mother's quick thinking saved me from being among them. Then my Aunt Irene Helfgott, whose husband had been shot, was deported to a labor camp, and I was left to look after my cousin, Anne, my aunt's 5-year-old daughter. Then there was the final selection. Everyone without work permits, which included me and Anne, were lined up outside the ghetto, waiting to be loaded onto trucks. We were guarded, none too gently, by police and soldiers with rifles, supervised by a German officer. I don't know what gave me the idea or the courage, but I stepped out of line, walked up to him, explained that I had been separated from my father and brother, and asked if I could go back into the ghetto. He looked at me with amazement, then smiled, and told one of the policemen to take me back inside. On the way, after an argument, I managed to collect my cousin Anne too. All those remaining had work permit and were sent to 2 local labor camps, and the ghetto was liquidated. My father and brother were allocated to the local plywood factory, where through an unbelievable stroke of luck, I also managed to go, together with Anne. So at the age of 12, I became a slave laborer. For almost 2 years, I was working with machines that made plywood huts for the German army. We did not live together as a family. Men and women were housed separately. And while I was out at work, other women in the barracks kept an eye on Anne. Living conditions were grim, and food was at barely subsistence level. But somehow we managed to keep going. Then, towards the end of 1944, the final deportation took place. My father and brother were sent to Buchenwald with the men, Anne and I, 2 aunts, and a number of my friends were deported with the women to Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was in Germany, north of Berlin. Although conditions had been constantly deteriorating, and at times we felt that they could not get any worse, somehow we managed to retain our hope. But when we arrived in Ravensbrück, we felt that we would not survive. We had to queue up, and all our details were recorded. Then we had to undress. Everything was taken away from us. Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers and were given the concentration camp garb, which consisted of a thin striped skirt, jacket, and a pair of clogs. When we emerged at the other end, we could not even recognize one another. We all looked the same. Our personalities, our very souls had been taken from us. And at that moment, we lost hope. One of my aunts, Franja Klein, died within a few days. And my best friend, Pema Blachman, died soon after that. People were just giving up. I was in Ravensbrück for a little over 2 months, and my main memories are of the interminable appels, when we had to stand on the parade ground and be counted repeatedly until the numbers were correct. And the meager daily rations, half a slice of something dark called bread, some grey liquid called soup, and some brown liquid called ersatz coffee. But little did we know what was to come. In February 1945, as the Russian army was approaching, the Germans became anxious to hide the evidence of their evil deeds. So we were marched to the cattle trucks again, and at the end of that journey, we found ourselves in Bergen-Belsen. When we arrived, the place was so overcrowded, we were put up in a large tent on bare ground, and this in midwinter, with temperatures well below freezing. Next morning, we entered the main camp, and the scene that faced us defies description. It was like something out of hell. There was a kind of smog and a smell, and skeletal figures shuffling along aimlessly like zombies. There were dead bodies everywhere and large piles of twisted, decaying, decomposing corpses. Typhus and other diseases were raging. Food was almost non-existent. We were allocated to a hut, but the accommodation was so overcrowded that a hut which should have held 80 might contain hundreds of people, as many as 1,000. Then, quite by chance, I heard that there was a children's hut somewhere in the camp, so I set out to find it. And this is the hut, 211, the children's hut. When we got there, we were interviewed by the people in charge, Dr. Bimko and Sister Luba. And although at first they would not accept us because they also were very overcrowded, with some persistence, I managed to get my cousin and myself admitted. The children were mostly Dutch, but there were some other nationalities too. I still have a vivid picture of the view from my window. There was a shed for dead bodies right opposite us, and a constant procession all day. At first, bodies were brought in rather dilapidated carts, but after that, they were dragged along in blankets, and then it finally degenerated into a body being just dragged along by a limb and just thrown into this hut. Just as awful was that the people who were forced to do this were barely alive themselves. Although the conditions in the children's homes were marginally better, I went down with typhus and was extremely ill. I was unaware of my surroundings for quite some days and must have been starting to recover when one day in an upper bunk by the window, I saw some emaciated people running towards the gate. And all I could think of was, how did they have the strength to run? That was the moment of liberation, when the British troops entered the camp on the 15th of April, 1945. Within 2 days, a hospital was set up, and the medical, nursing, and relief teams under the command of Brigadier Glyn Hughes gave themselves body and soul to the task of saving lives. Thanks to their dedication, commitment, and compassion, I was nursed back to health. I still remember their kindness after suffering years of cruelty and deprivation. When the British took over, the German commandant Kramer was immediately arrested, and the guards were forced to collect the bodies, which could only be buried in mass graves. Then all the huts were burnt, and a temporary memorial was set up. In July 1945, Anne and I were sent to Sweden with a group of children for rehabilitation, and subsequently I learned that my brother Ben was the only other survivor of my immediate family. He was among a group of children survivors who had been flown to England in August 1945, and from him I heard that our father had been shot trying to escape from a death march, and that was only 4 days before the end of the war. Ben and I were reunited when I came to England in 1947. There was no financial support for immigrants in those days. I was sponsored by a Jewish charitable organization, and my first task was to learn the language and sufficient skills to support myself, which I was able to do within 12 months. I joined a social club which had been set up to help survivors to integrate with the community. And through friends, I met Maurice Tribich, a young architect who had spent 5.5 years in the Royal Engineers, some of it in the front line in North Africa and at Monte Cassino in Italy. We were married in 1950, had 2 children, 3 grandchildren, and enjoyed a happy life together for 43 years before he sadly died. Once my children were at school, I set about working at education that I had missed and took O and A levels and eventually obtained a degree in sociology from London University. Some years ago, to help me prepare a PowerPoint presentation, my friend David, a retired doctor and a very old family friend, did a computer search for information about my hometown. And he found the original typed list of the names and ages of transport 132 of 277 Jewish women and 9 children who were deported from Piotrkow to Ravensbrück at the end of November 1944. And on that list, he found my name and the names of my aunts, my cousin Anne, and he told me that although he had heard me tell my story several times, to see the actual physical evidence of what had happened to us left him in tears. Yet there are still people who say that it never happened. About 20 years ago, I started to speak in public about my experiences during the war, mainly at schools under the auspices of the Holocaust Educational Trust, and at Bet Shalom, the Holocaust Center in Nottingham. More recently, since the appointment of head ambassadors, I find that I'm speaking quite often at universities. So contrary to the rumors that come back to us from overseas, Holocaust education is very active in the UK and is strongly supported by the government. When we speak about the Holocaust, we have to remember that it was not only the Jews who were the victims. The extermination program started as early as 1940 with the mentally and physically handicapped, on whom, by trial and error, the men who became the notorious commandant of the extermination camps at Sobibor and Treblinka, Franz Stengel, learned his trade and how to square his conscience. And when it was in full swing, the victims included also the Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other groups who did not conform to the Nazi ideal. One would have thought that the revelation of the hideous crimes against humanity that took place in Germany and the occupied countries during the Second World War would have been such a shock to humankind that any resurgence of such destructive racial and religious hatred would be inconceivable. Yet, in spite of the Holocaust being the best documented atrocity in the whole of human history, there are people who claim that it never happened. So this, to me, is the value of what we remaining survivors are doing. Remembering the victims and teaching the generations that follow us to be ever on their guard against the denial and the repetition of such evil. When I did my first trial run of this talk, David said, "You can't finish with that slide. You need something more upbeat." Would you ever have dreamt that when you were queuing up and shivering, when you arrived at Ravensbrück on that freezing November day in 1944, that almost 60 years later you would be doing what's on the next slide? And I said, not in a million years. Thank you very much.